Welcome to the GT350 Garage. My name's Walter, and in this video, I'm going to share everything you need to know about tuning a high compression engine to run on modern premium pump fuel. What I'm talking about are engines in the 10.5 to 12.5 to 1 compression range using ordinary 91 to 93 octane gasoline. If you want to learn how I've done this for nearly 20 years safely, successfully, and without sacrificing power, then this is the video you've been waiting for. I'd like to start by saying thanks to everyone watching my videos, and especially to my subscribers for returning to watch when I post new video content. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. If you find this information useful and it helps you with your own project, be sure to hit that thumbs up and leave a like too. If you have any questions, drop a comment below. I try and answer them the best I can within a day or so. Now, because of the diversity of my experience, I'm in a unique position to apply modern solutions to problems on vehicles with older technologies. My videos are a way for me to share the knowledge that I've gained from more than 30 years in the automotive industry. And speaking of sharing, if you find this video useful, I hope you'll share it with anyone else who could also benefit from this information. Now, let's talk about tuning a high compression engine to run on modern premium pump fuel. By modern standards, high compression is any engine with a static compression ratio over 10 to 1. But prior to the muscle car era, from 1964 to 1974, 8 to 1 compression was considered high compression. Now since 2010 or so, more and more engines are using compression ratios over 10 to 1, some reaching as much as 13 to 1. And many are running 10 to 1 or higher compression ratios in combination with forced induction. The modern Shelby GT350 Mustangs produced from 2015 to 2021 implemented 12.5 to 1 compression to produce 100 horsepower per liter of displacement. That's no small feat for a mass-produced vehicle. And before you click away saying they can only run that much compression because they're computerized fuel-injected applications, you might want to hold on and hear what I'm about to say. 100 horsepower per liter is the performance benchmark that I've set for the engine that I'm building for my 66 Shelby GT350. I'll be using 12 to 1 compression, a carburetor, a distributor, and no computers and no complicated modern technology. I've been modifying, building, and tuning engines in all kinds of vehicles since the early 1990s. Along the way, I've heard just about every excuse imaginable to justify the idea that high compression and modern unleaded pump gas aren't compatible. The biggest source of this claim comes from the generation that lived through the original muscle car era. And these folks are under the mistaken pretense that the gasoline of the mid-60s to mid-70s was somehow vastly superior to the gasoline that I've been using since starting my career way back in 1988. The notion that modern fuel is an inferior, watered-down product is flat out wrong. In fact, if I had $1 for every time I've been told high compression engines won't run on pump gas, it would easily pay for my current engine build with stacks of dollars to spare. So, tuning the high compression engines in muscle cars and even modern high performance engine builds using compression ratios over 10 to 1 to run on today's 91 to 93 octane pump fuels is a pretty polarizing topic. There are a lot of opinions on the topic. Most are that it flat out won't work. Some acknowledge that it might work, and a few will admit that it works, but they won't go into any details on how. These opinions appear in articles and videos on the subject, but like a lot of the information found on the internet, supporting materials are often out of date, they're misleading, they're vague, or they just lack any fundamental understanding of tuning for modern fuel. Typically, they all return to the same antiquated idea that the solution to tuning higher compression engines is more octane, because they understand that increasing the octane prevents pre-ignition and knock. Octane alone is not the answer to tuning a high compression engine, but it is a great place to start this discussion. To begin with, I want to acknowledge that higher octane does in fact work well to produce a predictable and stable combustion event in a high compression engine. But I have to stress that higher octane gasoline has two things working against it. The first is that it has a lower energy content than a lower octane gasoline. And the second is that it is more resistant to releasing the energy it contains. Now, the first issue is accounted for in your air-fuel ratio, and through proper tuning, the ideal air-fuel ratio can be sorted out. The second issue is more complex. It relates to either the compression ratio or the ignition timing. By increasing the compression ratio to utilize higher octane, the available energy in the fuel mixture becomes more densely concentrated, and this makes it more reactive from both the pressure itself and the heat generated from increasing the pressure with a high compression engine. Now, alternatively, increasing the octane in an engine but keeping the compression the same requires the ignition timing to be advanced to extract the full potential energy at the correct time to produce maximum torque. And this is where things start to get interesting, and we can begin to dispel the myth that modern pump gas is not compatible with high compression. Before we go any further, we need to take a look back at the fuel being sold in the mid-60s to the mid-70s and directly compare it to the fuel that we have today. About 45 years ago, pump octane numbers, PON, in the United States began to be calculated using the anti-knock index. Now, AKI is the formula you see on the label at the pump, displaying the fuel's pump octane rating. The formula, R plus M divided by 2, averages the older research octane number with the motor octane number to produce the pump octane number. And that's what you see on the label at your local fuel station. The mistaken idea that fuel quality and octane was lost in the mid to late 70s actually came from the adoption of the anti-knock index and the use of pump octane numbers. It's not because of the evolution of gasoline itself. This is what leads to the mistaken notion that modern gasoline is somehow an inferior product, despite it being a higher quality product than it ever was back then. So let's talk about sources of octane, because these are additives to the gasoline produced in the refining process. Now, bear in mind, base gasoline produced from the refining process is about 70 octane without any of the additives. In the late 1950s, the federal government approved increasing the amount of lead contained in gasoline. They nearly doubled it. Simultaneously, BTEX was an additive package that consists of benzene, toluene, ethyl-benzene, and xylene, and it was also used to increase the fuel octane in addition to the tetraethyl lead. Now, the formation of the EPA and the creation of the Clean Air Act had a major impact on the additives in the fuel. Through the requirements that were placed on automotive manufacturers to clean up the air and the technologies they were mandated to employ, it was discovered that heavy metals were not compatible with catalyst technologies. And as a result, changes were necessary to remove metals from gasoline. So since the mid-1970s, the additive packages have changed to completely remove tetraethyl lead and almost completely remove benzene. But as these components of fuel additive packages were removed, others were added to balance the performance of the fuel. Since the biggest aspect of this debate is about octane ratings, and as I've already mentioned, I've heard countless times that the octane of modern fuel isn't high enough to support high compression, like gasoline did back in the muscle car era. I need to show you how that's simply not true. Prior to 1975, octane was determined using the research octane number, or the RON method. Regular fuel was 90 to 94 RON. Premium was 95 to 99 RON, and super premium fuels were 100 to 106 RON. Now this sounds amazing, right? Well, not exactly. You see, if we take a look at the RON numbers for modern gasoline to draw a direct comparison to the octane ratings of the mid-60s to the mid-70s, it exposes just how similar the octane ratings of today are to the octane ratings of the muscle car era. Take a look at this chart I'm putting up. Modern regular 87 and mid-grade 89 octane lands a solid RON octane range of 90 to 92. Now that's comparable to the regular grades of the 60s and 70s. Modern premium grades at 91 to 93 octane are right at the RON octane range of 95 to 97. Again, comparable to the premium grades of the past. The octane ratings today are extremely close to the fuels of 50 to 60 years ago. Since I've gone to the effort of researching the equivalent octane ratings in RON and MON for our modern anti-knock index rated fuels, I should also mention that RON is still the standard for octane measurement in Europe and most countries in the world. So here's the fuel door label from my wife's Porsche Cayenne, and it specifies unleaded fuel only, and it clearly states premium minimum using the R plus M over 2 method has to equal 91, and super needs to be a minimum RON number of 95. Now, this confirms the data that I have in the chart, and I did a bunch of research to make sure that I had accurate numbers. Now, I'm sure some of you are ready to argue that 91 octane falls short of the muscle car era premium fuel RON octane range. But you need to stick this out to see that there's far more to this process than just addressing the fuel octane. And 1, even 2 points of octane on the RON scale are not enough to stop us from tuning engines for high compression. Now, consider too that most engines of the 60s and the early 70s were designed to run on regular or premium fuel of that era, not super premium fuels. So there really isn't an issue with tuning them to run on our modern 91 to 93 octane fuels, because for all intents and purposes, the octane rating is incredibly similar, if not the same, due to the other qualities of modern gasoline. In the event you can't wrap your head around using ordinary premium, there are still super premium emissions compliant high octane fuels available. Fuels like Sunoco's Ultra 94 and GT 100, VP's Street Blaze 100, and Trick 101. And there's a few others available at the pump or by pail regionally. You just have to do some hunting around to find them. And these are available without stepping all the way up to actual race fuels. But they aren't necessary for running up to 12 to 1 compression. And, well, let's face it, we can't talk about emissions compliant high octane fuels without mentioning E85 with its 108 pump octane number, and the unfortunate reputation that it is somehow the magic elixir that solves high compression tuning problems. Again, this fixation on high octane is directly tied to the antiquated notion that increasing ignition timing advance is what makes power, and the only way to run the ignition timing advanced to the point that some enthusiasts are accustomed to is to drastically increase octane ratings. There are actually some significant differences between the fuels from 50 plus years ago and today. But contrary to the myths, the supposed lack of octane is not the smoking gun that explains things away. More notable differences are that modern fuel burns cooler, faster, and more completely to produce lower emissions. And those characteristics are important to this discussion. The fuel burning faster is where our longtime enthusiasts get the mistaken idea that the octane is somehow lower. See, this idea comes from trying to tune the engine using the advanced timing values that were being used with leaded fuels in the muscle car era. And these continued to be perpetuated by values that they saw in magazine and later internet dyno articles, or even in books that were written in the period that simply didn't have the knowledge of the fuel that's available to us now. With ignition timing significantly advanced, engines experienced pre-ignition or detonation under high load. And without the advent of wideband air fuel sensors, exhaust gas temperature probes, and NOx sensors, even the experts of the late 70s through the turn of the century were in the dark technologically, and they couldn't afford the testing equipment to properly utilize pump gas. As a result, they turned to readily available race fuels and ignored pump gas as much as possible. Since about the mid-1990s, with tetraethyl lead gone and benzene severely restricted, fuel producers have found octane and performance through oxygenation and by blending in additional additives such as MTBE, which was completely banned in 2005 due to groundwater contamination concerns, and of course, through the use of ethanol. Now, ironically, Henry Ford had originally designed the Model T to run on ethanol, but at the time it was cost prohibitive to produce in mass quantities. So he went with gasoline. Now, 100 years later, the tables have turned, and ethanol is a viable fuel with a cost that currently makes it attractive as an additive or an alternative to gasoline. But with any change, there's good and bad, and the addition of ethanol to gasoline is no exception. So let's address the good and the bad. The practical downsides to ethanol are that it has performance and compatibility issues in older fuel systems. It's not compatible with rubber and some synthetic or composite gasket materials. Prolonged exposure to ethanol can corrode some metal surfaces and damage some coatings and finishes. More concerning, though, is that ethanol attracts water, and that's bad news for cars that aren't driven regularly. Fortunately, there are some solutions to these problems in the way of stainless fuel tanks and lines, improved hoses, better rebuild parts, and fuel stabilizers that remove water from the fuel system. Now, ethanol's performance downsides are related to it having a lower energy content, meaning it takes a greater volume of fuel to pack the same amount of energy into the cylinder as it would with gasoline. How much more? It takes about 1.5 times as much ethanol as it would gasoline to produce the same power. This means as the volume of ethanol by percentage in your fuel increases, the total volume of fuel being consumed also needs to increase. And that means increasing fuel metering via larger carburetor jetting or increased fuel injector size or longer pulse widths, as well as increasing fuel delivery capacity through larger lines and higher volume pumps. Again, these solutions are readily available, but the costs can add up. Ethanol's upside is that it brings some desirable qualities to the fuel blend. To begin with, pure ethanol has a pump octane number of 113, which is great for high compression engines. Ethanol becomes a vapor at a lower temperature than gasoline, and this has a cooling effect on the air-fuel mixture as it enters the combustion process. That cooling effect not only contributes to increasing the effective octane rating of the fuel, but it also helps prevent the formation of NOx emissions in the combustion process. And even though that's not something most performance enthusiasts will prioritize, it is good for the environment. So for nearly 20 years now, ethanol blended into gasoline has given pump fuel an even greater ability to be used in high compression engines. Blending the two fuels together to make the finished fuel 10% ethanol by volume what we call E10 gasoline, increases the octane of the gasoline alone by 3 points. So a 90 octane gasoline that's blended with 10% ethanol becomes 93 octane. Now, despite the fact that ethanol contains less energy than gasoline, which means fuel economy will never equal a 100% gasoline product, with some small changes to accommodate a modest increase in fuel demand, it makes the same power. For this very same reason, even though E85, which is 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline, and is super popular for its 108 octane pump rating, is capable of supporting high power outputs in high compression and forced induction applications. But it gets terrible fuel economy due to the drastically lower energy content in the fuel, especially if it's compared to what would be achievable from a 108 octane unleaded gasoline. So far, we've established that the octane rating of modern premium fuel is in fact virtually the same as the premium fuels of the muscle car era, meaning our current fuel can in fact allow for a higher compression ratio. We've also learned that although modern fuel has a different energy content, extracting the same power from the engine is only a matter of adjusting the quantity of fuel delivery. So now we need to also recognize that more cylinder pressure means not only higher power levels, but less overall pollution as well. Because through achieving a more complete combustion of the fuel, we reduce the byproducts of incomplete combustion that form unwanted emissions while we're making more power. At this point, we need to take a look at compression ratios and how they're established. Essentially, compression ratios just mean taking a larger volume of the air-fuel mixture and squeezing it into a smaller combustion space. The effect is to pack the air-fuel mixture tightly together so that the resulting combustion produces a higher cylinder temperature and pressure, which improves combustion efficiency and reduces wasted hydrocarbons. And that's how we achieve less pollution and less energy loss while we're producing more power. When we talk about compression ratio, the first thing is the static compression ratio, or the entire volume of the cylinder compressed into the space of the combustion chamber. We're going to use a hypothetical example here. So if the chamber's 50 cc's, including all the space above the ring, the compressed gasket volume, the piston crown, whether we have positive or negative volumes, you get the idea. All of that space is the combustion chamber. Now, you add that to the swept volume of the cylinder. So for this example, let's say it's a 500 cc cylinder. That gives you 550 cc's of total volume. Now, you can divide that total volume by the chamber volume, and in that case, 550 divided by 50 is 11. So that gives you a compression ratio of 11:1. Once you've established the math for your engine, you have the static compression ratio of the engine, and you can match the cylinder head, the induction, and the exhaust systems, and most importantly, the cam profile to the engine's desired performance characteristics using that static compression ratio. We also need to talk about dynamic compression. According to internet lore, this has everything to do with when the intake valve closes during the compression stroke. You'll hear the term dynamic compression thrown around with minimal explanation and maximum authority by folks who think they have a handle on it. But for the purposes of simplifying it for you, here goes. It's a concept based on only being able to compress the air-fuel mixture after the intake valve closes. So basically, dynamic compression is assuming that the swept volume of the cylinder is calculated from bottom dead center to top dead center for the 180 crankshaft degrees that equal the compression stroke. Now, by that logic, if our intake valve closes at 45 degrees after bottom dead center, which is not uncommon for a lot of camshafts to have that closing event even at 50 thousandths lift, we would divide 45 by 180, and that gives us a percentage of cylinder volume that is uncompressed. So since 45 divided by 80 equals 0.25, that number equals 25%. And we can apply that to a static compression ratio, and for this we're just going to say 10 to 1. It would reduce 10 to 1 by 25%, giving you a dynamic compression ratio of 7.5 to 1. Now this is where I'm going to break with convention and go against some really popular commentaries from within the industry to tell you that dynamic compression is an absolute crap metric for a high performance, high compression engine, and I can prove it. The first thing that we need to take a look at is cranking cylinder pressure. This is something that you can easily measure with a simple compression tester. Once you have a known value, you can mathematically solve the dynamic compression ratio for comparison to the static compression ratio and determine how efficient your engine actually is. Now, there's an effect called the specific heat ratio, and this determines the rate that pressure increases as heat is released from compressing a gas, or in our case, air. For atmospheric air, the specific heat ratio is 1.4. The next thing that you have to account for is the atmospheric pressure at the time of the compression test. And this is going to decrease with elevation and other atmospheric conditions. So you'll need to look it up for your location using a weather website. Exact would be great, but close is good enough here. And with this information, we can calculate the engine's actual dynamic compression ratio. So follow along as I work through this example. I spent over a decade working on Ford 5-liter high-output V8s that were found in the 87 to 95 Mustangs, and these engines were rated at 9 to 1 static compression. With the stock HO cam closing at 40 degrees after bottom dead center, dynamic compression would be a paltry 7 to 1, according to some of these well-known experts and their calculators. My former shop was located at 2,200 feet elevation, and the atmospheric pressure was about 13.6 psi. If we take 9 to 1 compression and we multiply 13.6 times 9, you get 122.4 psi. Now we have to multiply that by the specific heat factor of 1.4, and that gives us 171 psi as the ideal cranking cylinder pressure for a 9 to 1 compression engine at 2,200 feet elevation. Where this gets interesting, and it completely blows away the dynamic compression calculations using cam timing, is that when you use a compression gauge and take an accurate, real measurement of cylinder pressure, you're measuring your engine, and you're not playing with some model, okay? Now, during the compression test, it was common for a healthy, lower mileage example of those 5-liter high outputs to produce between 155 and 165 psi during a cranking compression test. So let's do some math, and we're going to look at the low and the high side that I just gave you. 155 divided by 1.4 gives us 111 psi. So now we've taken the specific heat ratio out. For our high side number, 165 psi divided by 114, or 1.4, sorry, gives us 118 psi. Now, since we've removed the specific heat ratio's effect on the cylinder pressure, now we can divide the pressure that we have by the atmospheric pressure, and that'll give us the compression ratio. So 111 psi divided by 13.6 gives us a compression ratio of 8.1 to 1. And 118 divided by 13.6 gives us a compression ratio of 8.7 to 1. And those numbers represent the actual dynamic compression ratios for those example engines in the condition that they were in at the time that the test was done. In both cases, the measured dynamic compression ratios are substantially different and, more importantly, more accurate representations of true dynamic compression than the number that's generated from the intake valve closing event using an internet calculator. You also need to keep in mind that air and fuel have mass, and as they're traveling at speed through the intake passages in the engine, they don't check the crank angle and decide to stop and let some of their friends get back out of the cylinder for the next intake cycle to lower the compression. Their mass and velocity as they're traveling through the intake ports can carry them past the valve and into the cylinder until the valve closes, even with the piston rising in the bore. This is why bigger cams make more power and fill the cylinder better, especially as engine speed increases. Because an air-fuel mass that's traveling at high speed is not going to want to slow down or stop until it hits a greater mass, meaning either the pressure in the cylinder past the valve or the closed valve itself. This brings us to the actual tuning requirements of the engine. Now, tuning in a dyno cell or on a chassis dyno should only be considered a starting point and never be treated as the final and definitive tune. One of the biggest mistakes that a novice tuner can make is assuming that the tune that produced the absolute peak torque output and maximum horsepower will be ideal in the car, and that's simply not the case. Another critical mistake is tuning only for wide open throttle operation. There's so much more to tuning an engine than peak torque and horsepower. We rarely drive our street cars anywhere near peak horsepower, and quite often our engines don't see more than half throttle even for a spirited on-ramp sprint. This is where it becomes crucial to understand what's going on in the combustion process at part throttle and lower engine speeds. To understand what's going on, we have to understand the way fuel burns and the characteristics of our specific engine. For nearly any engine you might be tuning, there are two main areas that you need to be familiar with: air-fuel ratios and ignition timing. But specifically, you need to understand how each relates to creating cylinder pressure at different engine loads. Something that changed the way I tuned engines over 2 decades ago was the realization that the horsepower and torque we all want comes from extracting the energy that's contained in the air-fuel charge. Now, around that time, I was deeply involved in tuning forced induction applications. And this is where I realized that the more air and fuel I put into the engine, the more power I could make. And at the same time, I was using less ignition timing. Now, when I realized that stuffing more air and fuel into the same space was the same as increasing the compression ratio, it changed the way I treated high compression engines from a tuning perspective. My forced induction experience is where I made the connection that if you compress the air and fuel into a tighter space, it becomes more reactive, and the combustion event actually becomes more efficient. So from there, I was able to realize that putting more energy into the combustion chamber through the air-fuel charge is what produced more power from the engine. So tuning forced induction combinations is where I learned the importance of ignition timing was little more than releasing the available energy from the air-fuel charge so that it could exert maximum force against the piston during the power stroke. Ignition timing doesn't actually determine the amount of power that'll be produced. It has no effect on how fast the air-fuel charge burns, and it ultimately doesn't have any part in how much cylinder pressure can be produced. All of those factors are determined by the available energy that's contained in the air-fuel charge and how densely they're packed together when they're compressed. Timing the ignition event to release that energy so that it exerts its maximum force on the piston during the power stroke is ignition timing's only job. Ignition timing itself doesn't actually determine how much power you can make from an engine. Starting with air-fuel ratios, you need to be aware that the old stoichiometric air-fuel ratio of 14.7 to 1 that gets quoted in magazines and books is no longer universally applicable to most fuels. When ethanol gets blended into gasoline at 10%, the stoichiometric air-fuel ratio decreases to 14.08 to 1, and for 15% ethanol, it's even lower at 13.79 to 1. Now, for the rest of this discussion, we'll call those numbers 14.1 and 13.8 respectively for ease of math. At the same time the stoichiometric ratio is falling, though, so is the total energy content of the fuel. Now, if you're lucky enough to have access to ethanol-free gasoline in your area, you can continue to use 14.7. Otherwise, you'll need to adjust the air-fuel ratio for the fuel that you're using to maintain the same energy content in order to make the same power. This is one of the main reasons that old-timers get trapped into thinking there isn't enough octane in the fuel. And as a result of having to back off the timing to avoid lean spark knock, they cost themselves substantial power. There's a modern term used to represent the stoichiometric ratio of any fuel as a value of 1, and it's called lambda. Now, lambda is primarily used in OEM fuel injection to simplify fuel calculations, and that's exactly what I'll use it for here in this discussion. In particular, if we had an engine that made peak power at an air-fuel ratio of 13.5 to 1 on 60s era leaded gasoline that had a stoich point of 14.7, you would divide your 13.5 air-fuel ratio by the 14.7 stoich point, and the number you get is the lambda value. In this case, 13.5 divided by 14.7 equals 0.92 for that engine. Now, as the fuel you're using changes, the engine still needs the same energy content in the air-fuel charge to make its potential peak torque and horsepower. Knowing the lambda value for one fuel lets us determine the starting point for the new air-fuel ratio for a fuel with a different stoichiometric ratio, like E10 or E15. So in this example, E10, 14.1, would still make peak power at 0.92 lambda. So what we do is we multiply the new stoich point for E10 by the lambda value for the old stoich point, and we get a new air-fuel ratio to target. So in this case, 14.1 times 0.92 equals 13 to 1. That would mean that the same engine that wanted a 13.5 to 1 air-fuel ratio back in the 60s is going to want a 13.0 to 1 air-fuel ratio in the 2020s. Now, in the case of E15, we would again just multiply the stoich point by the lambda value, 13.8 times 0.92, and we get 12.7 to 1. So if we were running an E15 fuel blend, which would give us a slightly higher octane value and potentially be less volatile, allowing a little more timing, we would want to run that engine just a little bit on the rich side at 12.7 to accommodate the E15 fuel. Now, with variations in the blending process of ethanol blended fuels, the true energy content of the fuel might be slightly more or slightly less proportionately to the change in the presumed stoichiometric ratio. So the exact numbers for an engine you're tuning might vary up and down by plus or minus 0.3 air-fuel ratios. The key takeaways here, though, are know your fuel and don't be afraid to jet up, because as the stoich point falls and the energy content of the fuel falls, you need to add fuel to maintain power. It's extremely important to understand the relationship between ignition timing and cylinder pressure. Now, most of you probably realize the pressure in the cylinder pushes the piston down and makes torque. But do you understand how and when that force has to be applied? A critical part of this discussion is understanding that peak cylinder pressure happens after the spark ignites the air-fuel charge, and that the density of the air-fuel charge and the shape of the combustion chamber determine how long it takes to reach peak cylinder pressure after the ignition event. For the engine to make maximum torque and horsepower, peak cylinder pressure needs to occur between 10 and 15 degrees after top dead center. Our ignition timing values are before top dead center. Now, this is true at idle, at cruise speeds, under light to medium acceleration, and even at wide open throttle. At idle, very little air and fuel are metered into the engine. The mixture is not particularly dense, so as a result, it's not as combustible. And that means it takes longer for the flame to reach all of the oxygen and hydrocarbon molecules. This means the engine needs more ignition timing advance. So in this respect, idle timing can range from 10 to 20 degrees initial advance if it's a mechanical only distributor, and from 15 to 30 degrees if you're using vacuum advance. And all of that will be determined by your cam and your compression ratio and how the engine's built. But that ignition timing is necessary to allow the mixture to completely burn and build up pressure in the cylinder to keep the engine running. If you have a lack of ignition timing advance at idle, it can result in a low idle vacuum, drivability issues like stumbles and stalling, and even warmer than desired operating temperatures. The same situation is occurring at cruise speeds with minimal throttle output. So timing in this range can be 30 to 50 degrees depending on the engine combination. And it's important to note that when timing at cruise is significantly retarded, it is also a commonly overlooked cause of engine overheating. Now, under light to medium acceleration, your timing values are going to be in the 20 to 40 degree range. And the more timing you can run, the better for responsiveness. Again, insufficient timing here can contribute to overheating issues, but too much timing here will cause pre-ignition or detonation. Finally, wide open throttle timing should be carefully adjusted to find peak brake torque by testing with a locked out distributor and 500 RPM steps on a dyno, or 2000 RPM sweep tests in a controlled location using a stopwatch. Once peak brake torque is achieved, timing should be reduced by a minimum of 2 degrees to avoid putting the engine into a spark knock condition. Now, with respect to the differences between modern gasoline and the fuel of the late 60s to early 70s, the premium gasoline that was being sold during the muscle car era burned slower, and it burned hotter than modern gasoline. As a result, the engines of the period made peak torque with 36 to 42 degrees of ignition timing. What that means is it's taking the air-fuel charge in the combustion chamber a full 46 to 57 crankshaft degrees at that engine speed to reach peak cylinder pressure. And again, our peak cylinder pressure needs to occur 10 to 15 degrees after top dead center. So from the time the spark is present to the time peak cylinder pressure is present is, in some cases, the equivalent of 1/3 of a stroke or 1/6 of a revolution. And that's pretty slow. Unfortunately, because of the high ignition timing values that are associated with these old engines and with that old fuel, the industry keeps clinging on to these numbers with some sort of sentimental attachment that perpetuates the idea that timing makes power. Hey, let's turn up the timing and make some more power. I mean, you watch a modern engine tuning video where they're on a dyno and they're going to keep cranking the timing up to try and make power. Now, if we run the same engines today and use modern premium fuel that we were running in the muscle car era on 60s and 70s era fuel, those engines are going to make peak torque with 26 to 32 degrees of ignition timing. And that means you're making peak cylinder pressure in 36 to 47 degrees, which is 10 or more degrees less and considerably faster, okay? For just about any engine speed, you're talking about a reduction in time of about 17-18%. Now, that's actually kind of desirable because it produces cleaner emissions and an overall more efficient engine. But this again leads back to the misconception that retarding the timing hurts power and people don't want to retard the timing. Now, when I was operating my dyno and providing tuning services in my shop, I proved to my customers many times over that this logic is completely wrong. As long as the ignition timing results in peak cylinder pressure occurring 10 to 15 degrees after top dead center, and the available energy from the fuel remains equal to the engine's needs, the engine is going to operate safely on modern fuel, and it's going to continue to make its full potential peak torque. Now, when we make changes to the engines of the muscle car era with things like better pistons, more efficient cylinder heads, modern cam profiles, and other modifications that affect the performance output of the engine, we're also changing the efficiency of the combustion chamber and the engine at the same time. There's some things to consider when you're modifying engines. Increasing airflow in or out of the engine, which is essentially changing your volumetric efficiency, increasing or decreasing the compression ratio, changing the camshaft profile, all of these impact how tightly we can pack the air-fuel charge into the combustion chamber. Now, when we're changing things like the pistons and the cylinder heads, we're also changing the shape of the combustion chamber, and that plays a critical role in determining how fast the air-fuel charge combusts from the ignition event. The air-fuel ratio ultimately determines the amount of energy that's available in the combustion chamber, and it's that energy that determines how much torque the engine makes. So finally, the rate that the fuel burns at determines how quickly the air-fuel charge will expand, and that's how we're going to extract the torque from the engine. These are all the factors that determine the ignition timing for the engine, and once they're all properly sorted, your engine will make all of the power it's capable of. As a final tuning note for using an engine or chassis dynamometer, you should always tune for peak torque below 5,200 RPM and peak horsepower above that point. But once you've found the ideal air-fuel ratio and timing, you need to build in a small margin of safety. Intentionally going 0.2 to 0.3 richer than the ideal air-fuel ratio and removing 2 to 3 degrees of ignition timing across the entire operating curve builds in a margin of safety that'll protect your engine from damage in the event of a fuel quality issue. It's always tempting to mimic that engine article you just read on the small block build you've been dreaming about. You see it made peak power on an engine dyno with 36 degrees of total timing, and you're tempted to put that exact combination in your car. But if you don't adjust the total timing to 33 to 34 degrees to be safe and set up the air-fuel ratio just slightly rich, you're going to find the knock limit, even with the same fuel that was used for tuning, and you're going to be at risk of that severe engine damage in a potentially very expensive engine, and nobody wants that kind of a failure. So I do recommend make sure that you err to the side of safety when you're actually setting up your tune. The entire point of this discussion has been to help you learn what it's going to take to properly tune your high compression engine and give you the knowledge to avoid detuning because of a bunch of old wives' tales about pump gas. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the video and find this information helpful and useful. And if you did, please give me a thumbs up and let me know. I appreciate that feedback. Now, if you have any questions about the video, go ahead and ask away in the comment section below. I try to respond to everyone within a day or so. And again, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that you can get notified when there's new content that I post. I thank you all for watching. I hope to see you soon in my next video, and stay safe out there.